So the first contract is the JBCC suite of contracts. And in the suite, and there are many contracts within the JBCC Series 2000, the CIDB says that we are able to use the Principle Building Agreement and the Minor Works Agreement. Both agreements are entered into between an employer and the contractor, and what the employer has to aid them in the particular contract and in the management of the contract is what we call the principal agent, who acts for the employer to manage the contract. So whilst there are multiple contracts within the JBCC suite, there's minor works, there's simple works, there's direct contracts, there's nominated, selected, subcontracts. We're going to focus on the two today that the CIDB say that we can use in relation to public procurement. So that's just a picture of the front cover of the Principle Building Agreement. And what's important to realize is, and the CIDB have in fact endorsed it, is that these contracts evolve, and they have evolved over a period of time insofar as there are various versions of the contract. We are currently dealing with version 6.2 of May of 2018. Now, people get stuck on a particular version. I know some of my clients that are still working on 2010 versions. And why do people do that? Because you become familiar with a particular type of contract, and you know the provisions, and so you don't want to necessarily have to move on. If I can just start by saying that when things evolve, when things change, when the JBCC send out new editions of the JBCC, like we have now the 6.2 editions of May of 2018, it's because we've learned things throughout the years. We've come to realize that certain aspects of the contract don't work. And so evolution of the various editions is a good thing. Yes, it might take a little bit of time to get familiar again with the new provisions of the contract. But rather than using an outdated version back from 2010 just because we know it, it's an older version, it hasn't been adapted for the changing circumstance, it doesn't take into account the new allocation of risk, and that's a big thing that we're going to see today, is that we're always trying to balance the risks in these contracts. Because if your contract is not balanced, in my opinion, and from what I've seen, the projects tend to not succeed. So I want everybody to feel comforted that there are people like me out there that are very happy to be able to work with everybody to see the new editions, to realize that the new editions are out there. They've been drafted with different clauses for very particular purposes, and they because we've learned lessons over the years, and so we have the new editions. So the edition that has been endorsed now by the CIDB is the 6.2 May 2018. And when JBCC published this edition, they said the goal of this edition was to provide balanced rights and obligations to protect the employer and the contractor. I'm not saying that previous editions didn't do this, but they didn't do it to the extent that this new edition does. So I really want to emphasize, let's have a look and let's work through the new editions where possible. So we had a look at 7 factors, and what I've done is I've taken the 7 factors that we looked at previously and I've applied it to every single contract. So what you can do is you can go back and have a look at, well, in terms, should I use the JBCC? Well, you have to first determine what works are being performed. And we ask ourselves, are there building works being performed? Because the JBCC is used for any type of building works. Insofar as management is concerned, we obviously want to look at contract management. As the employer, we want to know who's looking after us. And the JBCC provides that there is a principal agent that is appointed by the employer who has the full authority to act on behalf of the employer and will bind the employer, but interestingly enough, and I think very importantly, may not amend the contract. The employer is very happy with the contract as it is, and they've got the principal agent to manage everything, but the principal agent cannot amend the contract. And I want to give you an example. The principal agent, for example, has to determine whether you are entitled to an extension of time. The contract provides that if you want to claim for an extension of time, you have to put in your notice within a particular period of time. And let's say it says 21 days. When the contractor unfortunately misses the 21-day period and they are time barred from putting in their claim, the principal agent cannot unilaterally go and say, you know what, I'm sorry that you were time barred. It's a bit unfair. I'm going to give you 28 days instead of the 21 days. That the principal agent cannot do. The PA can never amend the contract terms. In terms of the JBCC, the employer is allowed to appoint other agents to deal with specific aspects of the works. So you've got your principal agent dealing with the building works, but perhaps you need a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer, and the employer needs to appoint those agents. The JBCC Principle Building Agreement makes provision for that. You will have recalled that one of the other aspects that we needed to have a look at, and this is so important, and you're going to appreciate why it's so important when we start looking at all the other contracts, is we have to ask ourselves, who is responsible for the design? In a JBCC Principle Building Agreement, the employer is responsible for the design of the permanent works. And the contract is only responsible for a very small portion of the design, being the temporary works. So if we were just to jump down to the bottom, we can see in relation to point 7 of the factors to consider that we're not going to use the JBCC if it's for works other than building works. And if the design of the works is required to be performed by any other party other than the employer, for example, the employer wants the contractor to design the work, we're not going to use the JBCC Principle Building Agreement. It's as simple as that. Then we have a look at factor number 6. Sorry, I'm not going in particular order, jumping a bit, but we have to have a look, are we going to use the JBCC depending on the pricing strategy and the financial risk? The JBCC provides that what we can have is a bill of quantities, and we all know that your bill is in relation to a particular rate for a particular piece of work, which is then multiplied, and you get paid for the quantity completed. So it makes provision for a bill of quantities. It also makes provision for a lump sum contract. And I've put there in brackets, a lump sum contract is a contract where the contractor bears all the risk if there is no CPA. What do I mean by CPA? Contract price adjustment. We often see in some of our contracts that there is a contract price adjustment provision where if things change, we get to change the contract price. But in a lot of these agreements, what we enter into as the contractor is a lump sum agreement with no CPA. So then if things change, unfortunately, it's at the contractor's risk. And that's something we must be aware of. And what did the JBCC say in relation to allocation of overall risk? They say the risk is allocated to the party best suited to deal with it. We're going to have a look in relation to some of the other contracts, how risk is allocated, so that you'll be able to see and make a decision for yourselves insofar as, okay, so this is the party that bears the risk, and I can see why this is the party that bears the risk, because in fact they are best suited to deal with it. So we'll have a look at some of those examples. And then moving on, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because some of the things are duplicated, but the second contract within the JBCC that we can use is the minor works agreement. It really is a lovely agreement insofar as we've got building works, but we are not dealing with a complex build. And the work is of a minor and simple nature. Here you can see the same applies with regards to that there's a principal agent. The design is again the employer who is responsible for the design. And importantly, the contractor here is actually said to be only responsible, as we've seen in the PBA, for the temporary works. But in addition, the contractor is not responsible for the coordination of any design elements. So it's a simple contract. It's minor in nature in relation to the build. And obviously, the contractual provisions are a lot less cumbersome to deal with than if we're dealing with a very complex build like we would in terms of the Principal Building Agreement. You can see there that insofar as the pricing strategy, the exact same as the Principal Building Agreement, but have a look at the overall allocation of risk. The employer carries the majority of risk related to the works and is responsible for taking out construction risk and public liability insurance for the protection of both parties. And then we see there is a risk for the contractor, where, as I described in the PBA, here we really see the provision for the adjustment of the contract amount to compensate the contractor for cost increases due to inflation is not present in this contract. It's because it's a small works agreement. We don't expect that there'll be anything complex. We don't expect that there'll be anything unforeseen. So when we tender, we know what we're tendering for, and the contractor then is not entitled to anything in terms of CPA. And then we ask ourselves,
Adine,
once we've done our checklist, yes, sorry.
Sean, I wanted to ask if you could perhaps give some examples of what is a minor works and also what is not complex. Maybe just give some examples just for the uninformed.
Yes, no, certainly. Let me actually I want to just see something because I did, that's not a problem.
You got something a bit later.
In fact, no, I thought about that myself as well. So I made some notes. So I just want to.
Yeah. So if someone is wanting to build a boundary wall, is that considered minor works of a non-complex nature?
Yes,
or a storeroom or something,
yeah. I mean, it needn't be that small. But when you have a look at what the JBCC says, what are minor works? And it's a very important question. Maybe this is going to help. It's quite difficult to actually pinpoint it to a particular build. But listen to what they say. They say that minor works is for straightforward or repetitive work. So there is no complexity in relation to work. There's no design required by the contractor. There's no mechanical and electrical plant. It's back-to-back subcontracting doesn't apply. Your time for completion is never more than 12 months. There's no requirements for sophisticated management techniques. And the design is complete even before the construction starts. So can you see it's simple, repetitive work, such as, if you were building boundary walls, that would be perfect. But we're taking out any design elements, mechanical elements, electrical elements. We're talking about a very short duration. We don't need a lot of management over the particular build. And so it's something that can be used Let me give you a good example of where I'm not using the minor works, because there's actually a fabulous, lovely new contract that's come out of the JBCC, which is the Simple Works Agreement, which is much more up to date in relation to a Simple Works contract. But I won't mention any names, but I am doing a project where a particular building supply chain have done the most fantastic thing insofar as they have gone and they have gotten the ability for their customers to obtain financing, in terms of which they are able to, by using the supply of by purchasing the product at this particular store, and they've got financing, the builders have got the material, and they are building, I would say, I wouldn't call it low cost housing, I would call it, I'm trying to think about how to describe it. It's financially viable homes, and they're actually very beautiful the way they are going to be constructed. But it's a simple build. It's not a complicated build in relation to a 1 million or a 2 million or a 3 million rand home. We're talking about a home which is going to be reproduced multiple times, in fact, several hundred times over a number of months. It's in relation to either a 2 or a 3 bedroom. And in relation to that kind of build, I am using the Simple Works Agreement. And I would say to you, Sean, that we would use, if we needed to, a minor works agreement in relation to that kind of build.